A freezing American wilderness. Midnight silence. One woman steps beyond the safety of her cabin, unaware the forest already recognizes her as something more than human prey. The Cascade Mountains of Washington state did not sleep the way cities did. They did not hum with distant traffic or flicker with porch lights left burning through the dark. They breathed, they shifted, they watched, and on that particular night, beneath a sky stripped bare of clouds, the forest felt especially awake. Evelyn Carter stood at the threshold of her small cedar cabin, fingers resting against the cold brass handle as if reconsidering her decision to step outside. The air was sharp enough to sting her lungs. Frost had already claimed the edges of the porch railing, tracing delicate veins of ice along the wood. Beyond the shallow pool of yellow light cast by the cabin's single bulb, the wilderness waited in layers of black and silver. She had lived on this stretch of land for nearly 3 years, far enough from Seattle to be forgotten, close enough to a logging road that emergency services could still find her if necessary. The cabin had belonged to her grandfather, a man who believed silence healed what people could not. After his passing, Evelyn had inherited not only the property but the solitude that came with it. She preferred it that way. In town, she volunteered at a wildlife rehabilitation center during the daylight hours, tending to injured hawks, orphaned raccoons, and the occasional black bear cub brought in by hikers who mistook curiosity for abandonment. Animals made sense to her. Their pain was visible, their needs were direct, their loyalty, once earned, required no explanation. People were different. Civilization had once felt like a promise to Evelyn. College in Oregon, a graduate program in environmental science. A brief engagement to a man who loved her ambition but not her silences. Over time, the noise of expectation had pressed inward, tightening around her ribs until she could not breathe. When the engagement dissolved and her career path blurred into something unrecognizable, she returned to the only place that had ever felt honest, the forest. Still, even honesty had its cost. That night, sleep had refused her. A restlessness tugged at her thoughts, subtle but persistent, like a word on the tip of her tongue. She had tried reading by the fireplace. She had brewed chamomile tea. She had counted the distant hoots of an owl perched somewhere beyond the tree line. None of it settled the unease humming beneath her skin. So she stepped outside. The cold wrapped around her instantly, threading through the wool of her coat. Snow had not yet fallen, but the scent of it lingered in the air, metallic and expectant. Pine needles shifted faintly in the wind, brushing against one another in hushed conversation. The moon hung low and swollen, bright enough to carve long shadows between the trees. Evelyn moved down the porch steps and into the yard, boots pressing into the brittle grass. She did not carry a flashlight. She rarely did. Her eyes had learned the shapes of this land, the dip near the old fence line, the curve of the stream 20 yards east, the crooked cedar that leaned like a sentry at the forest's edge. Tonight, however, those familiar shapes felt rearranged. The woods beyond her clearing seemed closer than usual. Denser, as though the darkness had thickened and taken on weight. She paused, listening. At first, there was only wind. Then even that seemed to fall away. Silence in the wilderness was never empty. It was a signal. Local hikers sometimes whispered about wolves in these mountains, though official reports insisted their numbers were small and carefully monitored. Rumors traveled faster than data. Stories of campers who wandered off trail and were never found. Of distant howls that did not match known patterns. Of yellow eyes glimpsed between tree trunks before vanishing without a trace. Evelyn had dismissed most of it as fear-feeding on imagination. Wolves, in her experience, avoided human contact whenever possible. They were intelligent, strategic, bound by hierarchy and survival. They did not hunt recklessly. Yet as she stood beneath the skeletal reach of the trees, she felt something she had not felt before. Recognition, not the recognition of a predator spotting prey. Something older, more deliberate, as if the forest itself had tilted its awareness toward her and decided to pay attention. A faint pressure built behind her sternum, subtle but undeniable. It was not fear exactly. Fear was sharp and urgent. This sensation was steady, almost curious. She exhaled slowly, watching her breath bloom into pale mist before dissolving. 3 years earlier, on her first night back in the cabin, she had crossed into the woods after sunset to retrieve a loose tarp caught in the branches. She had walked farther than intended, distracted by the glow of fireflies weaving between the trunks. At some point, she had felt the distinct impression of being observed. Not hunted, observed. She had brushed it off as nerves. Now, standing in the same clearing, she wondered if that had been the moment something unseen had marked her presence. The temperature seemed to drop another degree. Her heartbeat quickened, not from panic but anticipation. The forest no longer felt indifferent. It felt attentive. Evelyn took another step forward, nearing the line where grass surrendered to root and stone. Her compassion had always overridden caution. It was the trait that made her good at her work and vulnerable in ways she rarely acknowledged. She believed in tending to what others avoided. She believed hunger, when met with patience, softened. Somewhere deep within the trees, a branch snapped. The sound was not loud. It did not need to be. It threaded through the silence with deliberate precision. Evelyn's spine straightened, her gaze fixed on the source, though she could see nothing beyond layered shadow. Then she heard it. Low, rough, not aggressive, but wounded. A growl, drawn thin by exhaustion. Every instinct she possessed warned her to retreat toward the cabin's light. Instead, she found herself leaning slightly forward, listening more carefully. The sound carried weight, like a creature too proud to collapse yet too weak to hide its suffering. Evelyn understood that sound. It was the language of survival stretched to its edge. The darkness between the trees shifted, almost imperceptibly, and the sensation of being watched sharpened into certainty. Whatever stood beyond the clearing was not retreating. It was waiting, and for the first time since stepping outside, Evelyn realized she was no longer the only one deciding what would happen next. The most dangerous creatures do not attack first, they wait to be understood. The growl did not rise in volume after Evelyn heard it. It did not lunge forward or echo with threat. It remained low and strained, as if whatever made it was conserving the last of its strength. The sound carried through the clearing with a rough edge, scraping against the quiet like a warning that had arrived too late to prevent anything. Evelyn did not step back. Her body registered the danger. Her pulse accelerated. The muscles along her arms tightened beneath her coat. Years of working with injured wildlife had trained her to recognize the difference between aggression and desperation. This sound belonged to something depleted. Something proud enough to mask pain until it could not anymore. The darkness between the trees shifted again, and this time it did not hide. A wolf stepped forward slowly, its massive frame emerging into the pale spill of moonlight. Black fur, thick but dull by dirt and winter dryness, clung to a body that had grown too lean. The animal's ribs showed faintly beneath its coat. One rear leg moved with a stiffness that suggested a recent injury, though it bore weight without collapsing. It was not the size alone that stilled the air, it was the posture. Despite visible weakness, the wolf stood as if the clearing belonged to it. Evelyn had seen wolves before, mostly from a distance and once through reinforced fencing at a rehabilitation transfer site. None had looked like this. Its eyes were wrong, not in color, they were a piercing amber that reflected the moonlight, but in focus. They did not dart or assess the way wild predators typically would. They held her steadily, as if measuring not her body but something deeper. There was awareness there, layered and deliberate. The forest seemed to draw inward around them. No wind brushed the branches. No insects dared hum. Even the faint hum of the distant creek seemed to dim. The clearing was no longer part of the mountains. It had become a contained space, sealed by the silent agreement of everything living within it. Evelyn felt her survival instinct flicker to life, urging distance, urging retreat toward the porch light and locked door. Instead, another instinct rose higher. Compassion. She recognized the slight tremor beneath the wolf's steady stance. The way its breathing remained controlled but shallow. The way it positioned itself not to intimidate, but to endure. This was not a hunt. It was a creature stretched thin by hunger. Her training moved through her calmly. Do not make sudden movements. Do not break eye contact abruptly. Lower yourself slightly to reduce perceived threat. She shifted her weight and slowly knelt in the frost, ignoring the sting that seeped through her jeans. The wolf did not advance. It watched. Inside the cabin, in a small cooler near the back door, she kept emergency rations, raw venison portions meant for recovering raptors or foxes too weak to hunt. The thought surfaced without effort. She could retrieve some. The walk to the porch felt longer now, as if something invisible stretched between her and the animal. Still, she rose carefully and moved backward, maintaining that steady gaze. The wolf did not follow. It did not retreat. When Evelyn returned moments later with a wrapped portion of meat in her gloved hands, the clearing felt heavier, charged in a way she could not name. She stepped forward again, slower this time, until she stood within a distance most wildlife experts would call reckless. Close enough to see the faint scar along the wolf's flank. Close enough to notice that despite its thinness, its shoulders carried power coiled beneath restraint. She crouched once more and set the meat on the frost between them. The wolf did not immediately lower its head. It watched her instead, evaluating, deciding. Something about the pause unsettled her. Hunger should have overridden hesitation. Starvation reduced even cautious animals to urgency. Yet this wolf remained still, eyes locked onto hers, as if the offering required more than appetite to accept. Evelyn felt a strange awareness settle in her chest, not fear, not triumph, but recognition. as though this moment had been moving toward her long before she stepped outside. As though the act of feeding was not spontaneous kindness but part of an exchange she did not remember agreeing to. She lowered her gaze slightly, signaling submission without turning away. Only then did the wolf step forward. Its movement was fluid despite the injury, silent despite its size. It lowered its head and took the meat in careful jaws, never breaking the invisible thread between them. The sound of tearing flesh was subdued, controlled. It did not devour recklessly. It ate with precision, conserving energy, maintaining dignity. Evelyn's breath slowed. The sight stirred something deep within her, not just relief, but a sense of alignment. As if she had stepped into the correct position in a pattern far larger than herself. The forest remained utterly still, witness to the exchange. When the wolf finished, it did not retreat immediately. It lifted its head again, and for a brief, impossible second, the amber of its eyes intensified. The glow was faint, almost imagined, yet unmistakable. A warmth spread outward from her sternum, subtle but undeniable, like the first pulse of a distant drum. The air shifted. Evelyn felt it move through her, not around her. A current brushing against nerves she did not know she possessed. The sensation was ancient, heavier than instinct, older than language. It did not frighten her. It anchored her. The wolf held her gaze one moment longer before stepping back toward the trees. Its body merged gradually with shadow, black fur dissolving into darker black until only the faint outline of its eyes remained visible. Then even those were gone. Evelyn stayed kneeling in the frost long after the clearing returned to ordinary silence. Her palms tingled where cold had touched them. Her heartbeat no longer raced. It resonated, steady and unfamiliar. Something had shifted. She could not see it. She could not name it. But as she finally rose to her feet, the sensation followed her, humming beneath her skin like a quiet awakening. And somewhere deep within the forest, something answered. Some promises are not spoken, they are sealed by instinct. The feeding ended without ceremony. There was no final growl, no show of dominance, no sign of gratitude. The wolf consumed what it needed and nothing more, as though the exchange had been measured in advance. When it finished, it did not bow its head or bare its teeth. It simply looked at Evelyn one last time, amber eyes steady and unreadable, before stepping backward into the tree line. Its body disappeared with unsettling ease. One moment it stood beneath the moonlight, powerful despite its visible weakness. The next, it dissolved into the vertical shadows of the pines. The forest accepted it without resistance. Branches did not snap. Frost did not crunch. It was as if the wolf had never occupied physical space at all. Evelyn remained kneeling in the clearing long after it vanished. The silence returned slowly, cautiously, like wildlife testing whether the disturbance had truly passed. A breeze moved through the upper branches. Somewhere farther down the slope, the creek resumed its muted rhythm beneath thin ice. The ordinary sounds of wilderness reassembled themselves piece by piece. She rose carefully, brushing frost from her jeans. Her palms were numb from the cold, but a deeper warmth lingered beneath her skin, subtle and steady. She told herself it was adrenaline wearing off. She told herself it was nothing more than the aftermath of proximity to a wild predator. Her rational mind moved quickly to contain the moment, to file it under experience rather than omen. It had been a strange night, nothing more. The wolf had been starving. She had fed it. The forest was unpredictable. Animals wandered close to cabins when winter pressed too hard. There were explanations for everything. There always were. Yet as she turned toward the porch, a sensation followed her, not footsteps, not sound, but awareness. The clearing no longer felt empty. It felt observed from angles she could not see. Not by a single pair of eyes, but by many. The idea surfaced without invitation. The forest had witnessed the exchange. She paused halfway to the steps and glanced back at the tree line. Nothing moved. The shadows were ordinary again, layered and still. But the impression persisted. Wolves traveled in packs. Even when alone, they were rarely unaccounted for. If the black wolf had been an outlier, weakened and wandering, it still belonged to a structure beyond her understanding. Unseen witnesses. The phrase pressed gently at her thoughts. Evelyn exhaled and climbed the porch steps. The wood creaked under her weight, a familiar sound that usually grounded her. Tonight, it seemed distant, as if she were hearing it through water. She reached for the door handle and hesitated, glancing once more toward the yard. The frost reflected moonlight like scattered glass. There were no visible tracks beyond her own and the faint disturbances where the wolf had stood. Inside, the cabin felt smaller. The fire had dimmed to embers. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, softer than the forest's darkness but present all the same. She locked the door, though she rarely did, and leaned against it briefly. Her heartbeat had steadied, yet it felt louder than usual in the quiet space. As she crossed toward the sink to wash her hands, a faint tingling moved along her forearms. It wasn't painful, it resembled the static charge before a storm, subtle and prickling. She turned on the faucet and let cold water run over her fingers, watching as the sensation intensified rather than faded. Exhaustion, she decided. The human body did strange things under stress. She had worked double shifts at the rehabilitation center all week. An injured golden eagle had required constant monitoring. Sleep had been shallow and fragmented. Her mind was likely inventing significance where none existed. She dried her hands and moved to the small mirror near the fireplace. Her reflection looked unchanged, pale from cold, eyes slightly wide, hair pulled back in a loose knot. No visible difference. She almost laughed at herself for expecting one. Still, as she stepped away, she noticed something subtle. The cabin air felt warmer than before, yet her senses felt sharper. The crackle of the embers sounded clearer. The scent of cedar smoke seemed stronger. Even the faint draft slipping through the window frame carried distinct layers of pine and distant snow. Her body felt alert rather than tired. Evelyn tried to dismiss it. She banked the fire, turned off the porch light, and moved toward the bedroom. The wooden floor beneath her feet felt different, not unstable, but responsive. As though she were more aware of its texture, its slight give beneath pressure. When she lay down, sleep did not come immediately. Images replayed behind her closed eyes, amber irises, controlled breathing, the quiet authority in the wolf's stance despite visible hunger. She told herself she had done what anyone with her background would do. Compassion was not recklessness, it was responsibility. Eventually, fatigue overtook thought. When she woke sometime later, minutes or hours she could not tell, it was not to sound but to sensation. A faint vibration beneath her ribs, like a distant echo. She sat up in bed and listened. The cabin remained still, no scratching at the walls, no wind against the roof, only silence. Her pulse synced with the vibration, then slowly faded. Morning light had not yet reached the windows when she rose and dressed. A restless energy pushed her toward the door before reason could question it. She needed to see the clearing in daylight, to confirm that nothing had changed. The frost had thickened overnight, whitening the yard completely. The world looked ordinary again, almost delicate. Evelyn stepped off the porch and scanned the ground where the wolf had stood. Faint depressions remained, partially blurred by cold. Relief began to settle. Perhaps she had exaggerated the strangeness in memory. Perhaps the night had amplified details that daylight would reduce. She turned back toward the cabin. That was when she saw them. In the frost, circling the perimeter of her home, were markings she did not recognize. They were not paw prints. They were deeper, more deliberate, curved gouges that formed an incomplete ring around the structure. Each indentation cut cleanly into the frozen ground, spaced evenly, as if placed with intention rather than movement. Claw-like, not random, not wandering, encircling. Evelyn stood very still, her breath clouding in front of her as understanding began to gather at the edges of her thoughts. The wolf had vanished into the forest without violence or gratitude. The night had seemed to close around the moment as if sealing it. But the forest had not forgotten, and whatever had watched from beyond the trees had not left. The body remembers what the mind refuses to accept. Evelyn did not remember falling back asleep after discovering the markings circling her cabin. The next thing she knew, grey morning light was filtering through the bedroom window, thin and colorless, pressing against her closed eyelids. Her body felt heavy, pinned to the mattress by heat that did not belong to the room. The cabin was cold. She knew that before opening her eyes. The fire had died sometime before dawn. Frost traced the inside corners of the window pane. Yet sweat dampened the collar of her shirt, and a feverish warmth radiated outward from her chest and arms as if something inside her had been quietly ignited. When she finally forced her eyes open, the ceiling above her seemed too sharp, the wood grain unnaturally defined. Every line and imperfection stood out with uncomfortable clarity. The faint ticking of the cooling stovepipe echoed louder than it should have, each metallic contraction snapping against her nerves. Disoriented, she pushed herself upright. The room tilted slightly before settling. A wave of nausea rose and then receded just as quickly, replaced by something else, alertness. Not the groggy awareness of interrupted sleep, but a focused, heightened state that felt invasive. Her skin burned. Evelyn pressed her palm to her collarbone and inhaled sharply. The heat was concentrated, centered just below her left shoulder, where fabric clung more tightly than the rest. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, her movements steadier than she expected despite the dizziness. In the small mirror mounted beside the wardrobe, her reflection waited. She lifted the hem of her shirt. At first, she did not understand what she was seeing. The skin over her upper shoulder and collarbone had darkened in a precise, unfamiliar pattern. Thin, curved lines intertwined in a circular formation, not random and not jagged, but deliberate. The shape resembled a crest or sigil, composed of claw-like arcs that converged toward a central point. The edges were faintly red, as if freshly etched, though the skin was unbroken. She touched it. Pain flared instantly, sharp and electric, then softened into a steady pulse. The mark moved, not physically shifting position, but throbbing beneath the surface, as if it possessed its own rhythm. She watched in stunned silence as the lines seemed to deepen momentarily with each beat of her heart, then fade slightly before intensifying again. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Her breathing slowed in disbelief. There had to be an explanation. An allergic reaction, contact dermatitis from the cold, stress-induced hallucination. She searched her memory for rational anchors. She had not brushed against anything sharp. She had not consumed anything unusual. There had been no injury. Still, the symbol remained. The heat spread outward from it, threading along her shoulder and down her arm. She rolled her sleeve higher, half expecting to see the pattern extending further, but it stopped at the original circle. The skin around it looked normal, though warmer to the touch than the rest of her body. Evelyn stepped closer to the mirror. Her eyes looked different, not in color or shape, but in focus. The green of her irises seemed sharper, flecked with gold she had never noticed before. Her pupils adjusted quickly to the dim light, contracting and expanding with unusual precision. She leaned forward, studying herself, and felt an unsettling awareness press back at her from the glass. Almost predatory, the thought unsettled her immediately. She straightened and stepped back, shaking her head as if to dislodge it. Fever could distort perception. Stress could distort identity. She needed water. She needed clarity. In the kitchen, she poured a glass from the tap. The sound of running water rang crisp and amplified in her ears. She could hear the faint hum of electricity in the walls, the subtle creak of the cabin settling. Outside, beyond the walls, she detected movement, small animals shifting through underbrush far beyond the range she normally perceived. Her senses had sharpened. It was not imagination. She tested it deliberately, closing her eyes and focusing. The distant flutter of wings. The scrape of something against bark. Even the rhythm of her own pulse sounded deeper, more resonant. Strength followed. When she reached for the cast iron skillet to move it from the stovetop, her grip tightened unconsciously. The weight that usually required effort felt negligible. She lifted it with ease, holding it suspended longer than she intended before carefully placing it down. A flicker of unease moved through her. This was not exhaustion. Scientific reasoning moved through her mind in fragments. Elevated adrenaline could increase strength temporarily. Fever could heighten sensitivity. But those explanations frayed under scrutiny. This felt sustained, not fleeting. Controlled, not chaotic. Her gaze dropped again to the mark. It pulsed more noticeably now, the warmth intensifying beneath her skin. She pressed her fingers against it once more, bracing for pain. Instead of the sharp flare from earlier, she felt resistance, as though something beneath the surface pushed back gently against her touch. Curiosity gave way to something colder. Fear. The memory of the wolf surfaced with renewed clarity. The unwavering gaze. The measured acceptance of her offering. The faint glow in its eyes just before it vanished. The markings encircling her cabin in the frost. A connection formed that she did not want to complete. The cabin suddenly felt too small. Evelyn moved toward the front door and opened it without hesitation. Cold air flooded inside, cutting through the unnatural heat clinging to her skin. She stepped onto the porch, breathing deeply, letting the frost bite at her face. The forest looked unchanged in daylight, but the atmosphere carried tension. The tree line seemed closer again, more defined. As she descended the steps, the mark beneath her shirt flared hotter, sharp enough to steal her breath. Then she heard it. A howl, distant, drawn out, rising from somewhere deep within the mountains. It was not frantic or mournful. It was deliberate, a call layered with authority. The sound moved through her like a tuning fork striking bone. Her heart answered before her thoughts did. The pulse beneath the mark accelerated, and the lines on her skin burned brighter against the cold morning air. Another howl followed, farther away, then another, echoing in widening circles. They were not random, they were synchronized with her heartbeat. An alpha does not hunt alone, it rules through others. The howls did not fade after the first echo. They layered over one another, rising from different elevations of the mountain range, some distant and hollow, others nearer and sharper. To an untrained ear they might have sounded random, scattered across miles of wilderness. But standing in the frost outside her cabin, Evelyn felt the pattern beneath them. They were answering something, not each other, her. The mark beneath her collarbone throbbed in measured intervals, heat radiating outward with each pulse. It no longer felt like an injury. Injuries weakened. This sensation strengthened, as if drawing energy from the calls threading through the forest. Evelyn stepped backward onto the porch, the boards creaking under her weight. The forest beyond the clearing seemed alive with unseen movement. Not chaotic movement, but coordinated, structured. Wolves were social predators. Their packs operated under strict hierarchy: alphas, betas, subordinates, each role defined by strength and instinct. She knew this academically. She had studied behavioral ecology. She understood dominance displays and territorial patterns. What she had not understood was scale. This did not feel like one pack moving within its range. It felt layered, overlapping, as though multiple groups were responding to a signal that bypassed territory and distance. The howls were not territorial warnings. They were acknowledgments, her breathing steady despite the unease creeping along her spine. The starving wolf from the night before had not moved like an outcast. It had moved like something diminished but still commanding. Even weakened, it had stood in the clearing as if it expected obedience from the land itself. A realization pressed against her thoughts with quiet force. That wolf had not been wandering. It had been displaced. Evelyn's gaze shifted toward the deeper tree line where the animal had vanished. In wolf society, leadership was rarely surrendered without conflict. An alpha that appeared alone, injured and starving, did not fit the usual pattern. Something had fractured the hierarchy. Something had forced a leader into isolation. Betrayal. The word surfaced uninvited. The idea felt irrational, anthropomorphic even. Yet the more she replayed the encounter, the more deliberate it seemed. The wolf had not begged for food. It had accepted it as though it were reclaiming something owed. Its hesitation before eating had not been weakness. It had been evaluation of her. The heat beneath the mark intensified as the howls subsided into silence. Evelyn pressed her hand against her shoulder again, no longer expecting the sensation to fade. The pattern beneath her skin felt anchored now, settled in place with purpose. It was not a wound healing. It was a symbol stabilizing, binding. She remembered the ring of claw-like markings encircling her cabin. Not random scratches. A perimeter, a boundary drawn around her home. In wolf dynamics, scent marked territory. Visible scratches marked dominance. But this had been something more deliberate, a declaration. Evelyn's chest tightened as the connection formed fully. The wolf had not merely accepted food. It had claimed her, not as prey, not as caretaker, as something else. Ancient folklore occasionally surfaced in ecological studies, stories of humans bonded to animals beyond companionship, alliances formed in desperation or destiny. She had dismissed them as cultural myth, poetic attempts to explain coexistence. But myths rarely emerged without some origin rooted in observation. If such bonds existed, they would not be casual. They would disrupt balance. A human link to an alpha would not simply be tolerated. She would become a symbol, leverage in a fractured hierarchy. Her pulse quickened at the implication. The mark burned brighter, responding not to fear but to understanding. It was not infection, it was identification, a visible claim etched where others of its kind would see it. She was no longer neutral ground. Movement flickered at the edge of the clearing. Subtle, swift, almost invisible. Evelyn's head turned sharply, senses aligning with the disturbance before her eyes confirmed it. A shadow slipped between the trees, too large for a fox, too controlled for a deer. Then another, farther left. They did not step fully into view. They did not approach the porch. They remained within the boundary of shadow, watching, tracking. The air felt charged again, but not with the solitary weight of the night before. This was layered presence. Multiple heartbeats, multiple instincts converging around a single point. Evelyn stood still, forcing herself not to retreat inside. Retreat would signal vulnerability. Instinct, not training, not logic, told her that movement now would be interpreted. The wolves did not howl again. They did not growl. Their silence was more precise than sound. It communicated hierarchy without display. If the black wolf had been an alpha weakened by betrayal, its survival altered the balance. And if that alpha had bound itself to her in some ancient exchange, then her existence now represented power restored, or power contested. The mark pulsed steadily beneath her skin, neither painful nor gentle. Anchored, she had stepped into the clearing the previous night believing she was offering compassion. Instead, she had stepped into a structure older than her understanding. A hidden order operating beyond human maps and scientific surveys. An order that now included her. The temperature dropped as afternoon faded toward evening. The shadows lengthened across the yard, merging with the tree line until the clearing narrowed into a corridor of fading light. The shapes between the trees did not disappear as daylight thinned. They multiplied. By the time darkness settled fully over the mountains, Evelyn no longer doubted she was being monitored. The porch light illuminated only a fraction of the yard, leaving the outer perimeter cloaked in layered black. Within that darkness, movement continued, fluid, silent, deliberate. She locked the door before night fully claimed the sky. Inside, the cabin walls felt thin. Outside, shapes circled just beyond the reach of light. And as the final trace of dusk vanished, Evelyn understood one irreversible truth. The Alpha had never been alone. And now, neither was she. Power does not ask permission, it takes control. The shadows did not retreat with the sunrise. Evelyn felt them before she saw them. Even inside the cabin, with the curtains drawn and the fire relit, a subtle awareness threaded through her senses. It was not paranoia, it was alignment. Something within her had synchronized with the wilderness beyond the walls, and now distance meant nothing. Her transformation did not arrive as claws or fur or anything visible enough to confirm fear. It arrived in perception. By mid-morning, her hearing extended far beyond ordinary range. She could distinguish the rhythm of individual wing beats from a flock lifting off near the stream. She could sense the precise moment a branch would snap under shifting weight before it made contact with the ground. The world unfolded seconds before it happened, as if her mind had stepped slightly ahead of time. The mark beneath her collarbone glowed faintly under her skin, no longer merely pulsing but radiating a steady warmth that refused to cool. When she tried covering it with thicker layers of clothing, the heat intensified, as though resenting concealment. She stepped outside cautiously, unsure whether exposure would ease or escalate the sensation. The clearing greeted her with thin winter sunlight, frost dissolving slowly into damp earth. For a moment, everything appeared ordinary. Then a deer emerged from the tree line. It was young, lean, its coat mottled with the pale remnants of autumn. It stepped into the clearing without urgency, head lowered as if grazing. Evelyn remained still, watching. Ordinarily, the animal would have bolted at the slightest shift in her posture. It did not. Instead, it froze mid-step and lifted its head slowly. Its dark eyes met hers. The air tightened between them. Evelyn did not move, yet something in her stance changed, not physically, but internally. An instinct rose unbidden, ancient and structured. She felt the urge to assess distance, angle, vulnerability. Not out of cruelty, but calculation. The deer's breathing grew shallow. Its muscles trembled, not in preparation to flee, but in submission. Submission. The realization struck her harder than fear. Without intending to, she had projected something. The deer lowered its head further, exposing the line of its neck before retreating slowly, step by measured step, back into the safety of shadow. It did not turn its back fully. It withdrew the way subordinates withdrew from dominance. Evelyn staggered backward as if physically struck. She had not raised her voice. She had not taken a step. Yet the animal had recognized authority where none should have existed. Her hands trembled. This was wrong. She had devoted her life to healing wildlife, to protecting fragile ecosystems from imbalance. Now, imbalance radiated from her. The forest no longer perceived her as neutral. It perceived her as command. The mark flared hotter in response to her rising panic. A sharp pulse cut through her shoulder and down her arm, forcing her to grip the porch railing for stability. The sensation was not accidental. It reacted to her resistance, tightening when she rejected what it represented. She pressed her palm against it, breath unsteady. "I am not this," she whispered under her breath, though no one stood near enough to hear. The words felt thin against the weight inside her. Memories surfaced rapidly, the wolf's steady gaze, the howls synchronizing with her heartbeat, the deliberate ring carved around her cabin. The hierarchy she had glimpsed was no longer theoretical. It had extended itself into her body. Throughout the afternoon, the sensation of being tracked intensified. She did not see the wolves directly, but she sensed their movement like currents beneath ice. Circling, measuring, waiting. When she walked toward the stream to ground herself, smaller animals parted before she reached them. Birds lifted from branches seconds before she stepped beneath them. Even the wind seemed to shift direction subtly around her path, as if unwilling to oppose her movement. Power settled into her spine without asking. But power carried hunger, not physical hunger, something deeper, a drive to enforce order, to correct weakness, to respond when distance stirred with challenge. She felt it when a distant howl echoed late in the afternoon, a lone voice testing the mountains. Her pulse reacted instantly, the mark igniting in answer. The urge to respond surged through her throat. She bit it back. The heat became unbearable. Pain shot outward from the symbol, sharper than before, forcing her to her knees beside the frozen stream. The water beneath the ice vibrated faintly, mirroring the rhythm pounding through her chest. She clutched at her shoulder as if she could tear the mark free. The forest did not sympathize. It watched. Evelyn forced herself upright, staggering back toward the cabin. Each step felt heavier, as though gravity had increased around her alone. Her vision blurred at the edges, not from weakness but overload. Too much sensation, too much awareness pressing inward at once. She reached the porch and barely managed to climb the steps before her knees buckled. The moment she consciously rejected the instinct rising inside her, the instinct to command, to answer, to claim, the mark reacted violently. Heat exploded across her collarbone, searing without breaking skin. Her breath caught in her throat as dizziness swallowed her balance. She collapsed onto the wooden boards. The world tilted sideways. Sound dulled into a low hum. Through the haze, she felt the presence before she saw it. A shadow moved across the clearing with deliberate calm. Heavy paws pressed into frost without sound. A large frame stepped fully into the thin wash of late daylight. The black wolf stood at the edge of her vision. No limb marked its gait now. No visible weakness pulled at its shoulders. Its coat appeared fuller, darker, absorbing the fading light rather than reflecting it. The amber of its eyes burned brighter than before, not with injury, but authority restored. It approached slowly, stopping just short of the porch. Evelyn lay motionless, breath shallow, awareness fading at the edges. The mark beneath her skin cooled slightly at the wolf's presence, not extinguished but steadied. The alpha had returned, and it was no longer wounded. Kindness is never free in a world ruled by instinct. Evelyn did not know how long she lay on the porch before awareness returned in full. The cold had crept into her bones, but the burning beneath her skin had quieted into a controlled warmth. The alpha remained at the edge of the clearing, massive and still, its amber gaze fixed on her with unwavering intensity. There was no visible injury now. No stiffness in its stride. The weakness she had witnessed only a day before had vanished as if it had been temporary, a phase endured rather than suffered. Strength radiated from the animal in subtle layers, in the steady rise of its chest, in the measured placement of its paws, in the calm certainty of its posture. The forest felt different around it. Not tense, aligned. Evelyn pushed herself upright slowly, ignoring the dizziness that tugged at her balance. The moment her weight settled onto her feet, the mark beneath her collarbone flared softly, responding not with pain but with recognition. The sensation was unmistakable now. It was not random heat. It was connection. The realization formed with quiet inevitability. Her act of feeding the alpha had not been a simple exchange of survival. It had tipped a scale. Wolves governed themselves by structure. Leadership was contested, defended, reclaimed. An alpha weakened by betrayal would not remain unchallenged for long. If starvation had threatened its position, then nourishment, given at a critical moment, could restore not just its body but its claim. Life for life, power for power. The forest did not operate on charity. It operated on balance. Evelyn's choice that night had sealed something older than compassion. In offering food, she had offered continuity. In sustaining the alpha, she had reinforced its authority. And ancient systems did not accept gifts without binding terms. The mark pulsed once, deliberate and steady. She had not stumbled into this moment by coincidence. The thought unsettled her more than the transformation itself. The alpha's gaze held no confusion, no hesitation. It regarded her not as prey, not as caretaker, but as something selected. Chosen. The word pressed against her ribs with uncomfortable clarity. Her history in the forest, the night 3 years earlier when she had wandered too deep without realizing it, the sense of being observed long before the wolf appeared, all of it rearranged itself into pattern. She had crossed a boundary long ago. The alpha took a single step forward. The reaction inside her was immediate and uncontrollable. Her pulse accelerated. The mark brightened beneath her skin, sending a current down her arm and into her spine. Her senses sharpened beyond what she thought possible. She could hear distant movement miles away. She could feel the pressure of the ground beneath the wolf's paws as if it traveled through her own feet. It was not fear. It was synchronization. She tried to steady her breathing, to assert control over the rush of instinct rising within her. The urge to lower her gaze warred with the equally powerful urge to hold it. Submission and authority collided inside her chest, neither fully dominant. The alpha did not force her decision. It simply waited. That patience unsettled her more than aggression would have. It implied inevitability. It suggested that her resistance was temporary, a stage to be endured rather than overcome. The bond tightened subtly. She felt it in the way her thoughts aligned when the wolf shifted its weight. In the way her muscles prepared to move before she consciously chose to. Freedom, once unquestioned, now felt conditional. Not stolen, redirected. Evelyn stepped off the porch without meaning to. Her body moved with cautious precision, closing part of the distance between them. The air felt denser the closer she came, charged with layered presence. She sensed other wolves beyond the trees, their attention fixed on the clearing. They did not approach. They did not challenge. The alpha's survival had been secured. By her, the debt was no longer abstract. It was active. She understood then that balance required reciprocity. She had preserved its dominance. In return, it had marked her as extension of that dominance. Not as captive, not as servant, but as symbol. A living claim that no rival could ignore. Her heartbeat steadied as acceptance edged closer to awareness. The mark responded with warmth rather than pain. The alpha turned its head slightly toward the forest behind it. The gesture was subtle, but the message was unmistakable. Movement rippled through the tree line in response, shadows shifting, pathways clearing where underbrush had once stood dense. The forest was opening. Evelyn's breath caught. She could remain where she was, clinging to the illusion of separation, pretending the boundary still existed between her and what waited beyond the trees. Or she could step forward and acknowledge what had already been decided. The alpha began to walk. It did not look back immediately. It did not need to. The connection between them tugged gently but firmly, like gravity adjusting its pull. Each step it took resonated beneath her skin. Evelyn hesitated only once. The cabin behind her stood quiet and familiar, smoke curling faintly from the chimney. It represented everything she had retreated to: solitude, control, distance from the unpredictable demands of human society. The forest ahead represented something older. The alpha paused at the edge of the tree line and finally turned its head. Amber eyes met hers again. The path between the trees, once tangled and shadowed, now appeared clear, as if carved deliberately through branches and frost. Evelyn stepped forward, and the forest accepted her approach, parting just enough to let her pass. Acceptance is earned through suffering. The forest did not swallow Evelyn whole when she crossed into it. It assessed her. The moment she passed beyond the tree line, the temperature shifted. The air felt heavier, layered with scent and breath and something older than weather. The alpha moved ahead at an unhurried pace, its black frame slipping between trunks with silent authority. Evelyn followed, not out of obedience alone, but because the pull in her chest left no alternative. The deeper they walked, the more the wilderness rearranged itself around her. Paths that should have been uneven felt navigable beneath her feet. Roots did not trip her. Low branches seemed to curve just out of her way. Yet the sense of welcome was incomplete. They were watching. The pack did not reveal itself immediately. Instead, it made its presence known in fragments: the faint glint of eyes between branches, the soft press of paws against frost, the synchronized shift of air as bodies repositioned in the dark. Evelyn's senses, sharpened beyond human limits, mapped them without sight. There were many. They did not approach the alpha directly. They circled at a distance, forming a wide perimeter. The formation was not chaotic. It was structured, deliberate, like a tribunal assembling without words. Judgment. The word echoed through her mind with quiet certainty. When they reached a shallow clearing deep within the forest, the alpha stopped. Moonlight filtered through the canopy in fractured beams, illuminating patches of snow-dusted ground. Evelyn stepped into the open space and felt the weight of collective attention settle fully upon her. One by one, wolves emerged from shadow. Gray, brown, mottled, younger and older, each carrying a different posture but the same alert gaze. They did not snarl. They did not bare teeth. Their silence was more severe than aggression would have been. Evelyn stood alone at the center. No porch light, no cabin walls, no tools or shelter, only instinct. The mark beneath her collarbone began to burn again, not violently but intensely, as if reacting to scrutiny. The alpha remained at the edge of the clearing, elevated slightly on a ridge of earth, observing without interference. This was not a rescue. It was a test. The first movement came from her right. A young wolf stepped forward, muscles taut, eyes bright with challenge. It circled her slowly, not touching, not lunging. Its gaze searched her face, her stance, the steadiness of her breathing. Evelyn did not retreat. Fear moved through her like a cold current, primal and undeniable. Every human instinct urged her to back away, to protect her throat, to show submission. But something deeper held her spine straight. The mark pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, steadying rather than overwhelming. Another wolf approached from behind, closer this time. She felt the warmth of its breath near her shoulder. A low rumble vibrated faintly in its chest, not a threat, but a question. Who are you? The wolves were not testing her strength in combat. They were testing her endurance in presence. Could she stand within their circle without collapsing into prey? Minutes stretched. The pack tightened its formation. One wolf brushed lightly against her leg, deliberate and firm. The contact drew a sharp breath from her lungs, but she did not flinch away. Another stepped directly in front of her and locked eyes. Its stare held intensity meant to fracture resolve. Her pulse spiked, but she held it. The forest amplified every sensation, the crunch of snow, the synchronized breathing, the distant shift of wind beyond the clearing. Her body trembled once, then steadied. Time lost meaning. At some point, exhaustion crept into her muscles. Not from physical strain, but from the constant pressure of being measured. The mark flared brighter, heat spreading across her collarbone and down her spine. Pain lanced briefly through her shoulder, sharp enough to steal her breath. A thin line of blood surfaced where her skin had split slightly under the intensity. She felt it. The scent reached the pack instantly. The circle stilled. Evelyn expected a surge forward, an escalation. Instead, something else occurred. The wolves lowered their heads incrementally, not in hunger, but in acknowledgement. The blood was not weakness. It was proof that she endured the burn. Proof that the mark did not consume her. Proof that the bond did not break under pressure. The alpha descended from the ridge and stepped into the clearing. Its presence shifted the air immediately. The pack parted subtly to allow it forward. It approached Evelyn until only a breath separated them. The mark on her skin changed. The burning receded into a deep, settled warmth. The split in her skin sealed gradually, leaving the symbol darker, more defined, etched with permanence rather than volatility. The lines sharpened, no longer flickering but fixed. The test had concluded. The wolves stepped back as one. Not dispersing, but repositioning, no longer forming a barrier, but a structure around her. Inclusion rather than isolation. Evelyn exhaled slowly, her knees threatening to give way under the weight of what had shifted. She had entered the forest as something uncertain, bound by instinct she barely understood. She remained standing. Above the tree line, the first hint of dawn began to pale the horizon. The sky shifted from black to deep indigo, outlining the forms of trees in fragile silver. As light crept into the clearing, Evelyn felt clarity settle heavier than exhaustion. The cabin beyond the forest felt distant now, smaller than memory. Civilization felt abstract, fragile compared to the hierarchy that had just measured her and allowed her to remain. As dawn broke fully across the mountains, she understood with quiet certainty that whatever she had been before this night could not be fully reclaimed. And returning to human life might no longer be possible. Freedom always demands sacrifice. Dawn did not dissolve the gravity of what had happened in the clearing. Light filtered through the trees in pale shafts, illuminating frost and fur and breath, but nothing about the scene felt softened by morning. The pack had withdrawn to a respectful distance, no longer circling, no longer testing. They watched from the edges now, silent and disciplined. Evelyn stood where the night had judged her. The mark on her collarbone had darkened into permanence, its lines sharper than before, no longer flickering with unstable heat. It rested beneath her skin like a seal pressed into wax. The pain had subsided, replaced by something steady and grounded. The alpha remained directly ahead of her. Its posture was calm, assured, neither threatening nor inviting. Authority radiated from it in quiet waves. The bond between them felt stabilized now, but not complete. It waited. Evelyn understood that waiting. The forest was not deciding for her anymore. It was giving her a choice. The realization carried more weight than the test itself. Until this moment, everything had felt inevitable, the feeding, the mark, the scrutiny of the pack. Each event had unfolded with a force larger than her will. But now, standing beneath the thinning night sky, she sensed a fork in the path ahead. She could reject it. The thought formed slowly, fragile but present. She could return to the cabin, pack what little she owned, drive down the logging road before dusk. She could seek medical evaluation, expose the mark to specialists who would scan it, biopsy it, reduce it to cells and anomalies. She could leave the mountains entirely, move east, start over, pretend the forest had been a psychological fracture brought on by isolation. But even as she imagined it, her body resisted. The bond would not vanish quietly. She felt it in the way her heartbeat aligned subtly with the alpha's breathing. In the way distant wolves shifted when she inhaled. Severing that connection would not be as simple as distance. It would be rupture, and rupture had consequences. A low ripple of awareness moved through the pack, not audible, but perceptible. The alpha stepped closer by a single pace, its amber eyes unwavering. There was no aggression in him, only clarity. If she walked away now, the hierarchy would fracture again. Rival challenges would sense instability. The balance she had helped restore would destabilize. The wolves would not collapse into chaos, but conflict would return. Territory would be contested. Lives would be risked. Life for life. Power for power. The ancient scale would not tolerate imbalance twice. And what of her? The mark pulsed faintly as if answering the question. She understood instinctively that rejecting the bond would not erase it. It would transform it into something volatile. The heat that had burned violently when she resisted before would return with force. The connection, denied structure, would seek expression elsewhere. She might survive physically, but she would not remain unchanged. Accepting, however, demanded its own surrender. Evelyn thought of the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, the injured animals she had tended with steady hands, the fragile trust she had built with creatures meant to fear her. That version of herself belonged to human systems, paperwork, grants, scheduled appointments, polite distance. If she embraced the bond fully, she would no longer occupy neutral ground between species. She would represent power within one. The emotional weight of it crested all at once. Years of careful separation from chaos, years of constructing a life defined by restraint and healing, now balanced against something fierce and unapologetically structured. She had retreated to the mountains to escape expectations. Now the forest itself expected something of her. Her throat tightened. The alpha waited. The pack remained motionless. Even the wind seemed suspended between branches. This was not about domination or submission anymore. It was about identity. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly and allowed the sensations to surface fully, the heightened awareness, the sharpened senses, the instinct that rose not from cruelty but from order. She felt the fear beneath it, the human hesitation that still clung to familiarity. She could step backward and fight the bond for the rest of her life. Or she could step forward and redefine what she was. The forest held its breath. When she opened her eyes again, the alpha had not moved. Its presence did not coerce. It acknowledged. Evelyn exhaled slowly, the sound steady and deliberate. She stepped forward. The moment her foot crossed the invisible boundary between hesitation and acceptance, the mark beneath her collarbone ignited with sudden, blinding heat. The sensation tore through her nerves like lightning striking stone. Not destructive, transformative. Light flared briefly beneath her skin, visible even through fabric. The pack responded instantly, heads lifting in unified recognition. And as the fire beneath the mark reached its peak, something irreversible locked into place. Legends do not end, they relocate. The fire beneath Evelyn's skin did not consume her. It refined her. When the light faded from the mark, it did not dim back into flesh. It settled into something deeper, embedded not only in her body but in her posture, her breath, her presence. The final surge of heat left no wound behind. Instead, it carved clarity into her bones. She stood taller without realizing it. The forest no longer pressed against her senses in overwhelming waves. It aligned with them. The chaos of amplified sound and sense softened into structure. She could choose what to hear now, what to track, what to allow into awareness. The bond had completed itself not by overpowering her humanity, but by integrating with it. Across the clearing, the alpha lowered its head slightly. It was not submission, it was acknowledgement. The hierarchy that had fractured days before stabilized fully in that silent exchange. The pack adjusted positions subtly, their formation no longer testing or uncertain. Order radiated outward from the clearing in invisible lines, extending through miles of mountain and timber. Territories recalibrated, boundaries settled. The alpha's rule was no longer contested. And neither was hers. Evelyn did not transform into fur or fang. She remained visibly human, her heartbeat steady, her hands steady. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the way the world responded to her. When she inhaled, the air carried layers of information willingly. When she stepped forward, the ground did not resist. She was not prey. She was not predator in the way wolves were. She was something between. The days that followed unfolded without spectacle. The pack dispersed into the forest, resuming patrols and hunts with renewed cohesion. The alpha moved at the edges of her awareness rather than directly beside her, a constant presence woven into distance. The bond required no constant proximity, it functioned through alignment. Evelyn returned briefly to the cabin at the edge of the clearing. It stood unchanged, smoke curling faintly from the chimney, porch boards marked faintly from where she had collapsed. She stepped inside and felt the difference immediately. The space felt smaller than it once had. Not suffocating, but temporary. She gathered what little she needed, practical tools, supplies that would not tether her to a fixed structure, and stepped back outside without ceremony. There was no dramatic farewell. No destruction left behind. The cabin would remain for as long as weather allowed it. But it no longer defined her boundary. In nearby towns, subtle changes began to circulate in quiet conversations. Hunters noticed that deer migrated differently that winter, avoiding certain trails without clear reason. Hikers reported an uncanny sense of being observed yet never threatened. Livestock losses in outlying ranches dropped unexpectedly, as if predators had redrawn invisible agreements. No one traced the shift to a woman who once volunteered at a rehabilitation center. But they felt it. The forest had grown watchful in a new way. Evelyn moved within it with silent authority. She did not command hunts. She did not interfere with the natural rhythm of life and death. Instead, she corrected imbalance when it threatened to spiral, steering packs away from reckless conflict, sensing human encroachment before it turned destructive, guiding migration through instinct rather than instruction. She became a quiet axis around which wild order revolved. At times, she walked near the edges of town under the cover of night, unseen but present. She listened to the hum of civilization from a distance, feeling neither longing nor resentment. Humanity had not been erased from her. It had been reframed. Stories began to surface. Campers spoke of a tall figure glimpsed at the tree line just before a wolf pack altered direction. A rancher swore he saw green eyes reflecting firelight beyond his fence, eyes that did not belong to any animal he recognized. Children in nearby communities described dreams of a woman standing among wolves, her skin faintly marked with something that glowed like embers beneath snow. Legends form when patterns repeat without explanation. Over time, her name detached from records and schedules. The wildlife center replaced her position quietly, assuming she had relocated. The cabin at the mountain's edge weathered through seasons, eventually standing empty except for wind and memory. But the forest remembered. Years passed, winters thickened and thawed, generations of wolves rose and fell within the restored hierarchy. The alpha aged, then one day stepped aside without conflict, its lineage secured. Through it all, Evelyn remained, unchanged by time in the way humans understood it, anchored instead to the deeper rhythm of the land. Travelers continued to venture into the Cascades seeking solitude, thrill, or proof that wilderness still existed somewhere unclaimed. One autumn evening, long after her story had faded from local memory, a lone backpacker set up camp near an unfamiliar clearing. The air felt unusually still, though no storm threatened. He sensed nothing overtly dangerous, only a subtle awareness threading through the trees. As darkness settled, a low growl echoed from beyond the firelight. Not aggressive, measured, he turned toward the sound and felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched, not as prey, but as something being evaluated. Beyond the reach of flame, amber and green glinted briefly between the trunks. And the forest, as it always had, held its secrets close. The forest did not take Evelyn from the world, it revealed who she had always been beneath it. What began as a single act of compassion became a bond older than memory, binding human and alpha in silent dominion. She was never devoured by the wilderness, she was chosen by it. And somewhere in the Cascades, when the wind goes still and the wolves fall quiet, her presence can still be felt before it is seen. Because some legends are not written in books, they breathe in the dark, waiting to be recognized. If this story pulled you in, don't let it end here. Send it to someone who loves mysteries that feel almost too real to be fiction. Stories like this grow stronger when more minds start unraveling them together. There's a lot more waiting in the shadows of this channel, and the next legend might be even darker. Stay close to the fire, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Before you go, if you had stood in that clearing, would you have walked away, or stepped forward? And tell me, what country are you watching from right now?